Hello again, I'm Anisha Tank, and you join us on day 5 of the Singapore FinTech Festival 2020. It is the Talent Summit, and now it's time to talk about women who are shaping finance. Women hold key qualities essential for successful leadership. However, lingering corporate culture and structural barriers do continue to hold women back from key leadership positions. This has been a very big concern. So, we're now going to indulge in a conversation on how to better enable a pipeline of women leaders. Anna Lowe, Investment Director at SoftBank, is going to moderate. And on the panel, we have Natalie Black, who is Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for the Asia Pacific from the UK, Linda Chai, who is Partner and Chief Operating Officer at Loyal Valley Capital, Andrea Fletcher, who is Citi's Chief Operating Officer for Asia, and Olga Costas, Head of Private Debt Secondaries at Tikehau Capital. Without further ado, let's join Anna and the panel of female leaders to find out how women are going to keep on shaping finance.
Good day, good afternoon, good evening, and I'm so grateful you're investing 40 minutes of your time to be with us. My name is Anna Lowe, and I'm the Investment Director for SoftBank Vision Fund, and I'm focusing on Southeast Asia investments. The title of our panel today is Women Shaping Finance. This is my first time hosting a virtual panel, so instead of normally sitting on stage or going around the conference rooms and asking for a show of hands of attendees and looking who's in the audience, we can't see the number of females, but from what I gather from our registration information speaker agenda this year, that we have over 30% female speakers. That is great representation. But for this panel, I hope we are attracting both fellow females and male colleagues to tune in. We have assembled 3 very accomplished women in their respective fields to share views inside their organizations, as well as across the financial community more broadly. So for centuries, financial services sector has been a male-dominated sector, but in recent generations, we know that young female and male grads aspire to enter the financial services for their first job out of college, like the path I have chosen. And I remember meeting a fairly gender-balanced group on my first day of training in New York. Yes, and today women make up nearly half of all financial services industry employees, yet few occupy executive suites, and there remains a significant pay gap. According to the stat I found, Bloomberg's 2020 Gender Equality Index indicates that financial services have 18% female executives versus 51% representation of the overall workforce. And I know in the VC sector within I work, that 18% number easily can drop down to the single-digit percentage. So for the past 2 decades, whether it's Fortune 500, startups, banks, governments, we've all been advocating female leadership, but is the old boys club corporate culture still lingering? And are structural barriers still there to hold women back from key leadership positions? How can we better enable a pipeline of women leaders and create a more defined pathway for senior leadership? So our goal today is that whatever roles in industry, I hope you take away some ideas and perspectives from our panel, and that you can bring back and share with your colleagues and female managers and executives in your business. So here's what you expect in the next 35 minutes or so. We'll take a few moments to introduce each of our panelists, and then I'll kick off a conversation, asking questions and topics that draw out high-level themes and trends we should be thinking about. So let's start with the introduction. So first, we have Andrea Fletcher, Asia COO of Citi, where her 20-plus year career at Citi has taken her all over Asia Pacific. She is a keen supporter of diversity in the workplace and very actively involved in mentoring and leadership programs. She is top of mind as we identify senior executives to present the point of view from a very large global financial institution. Welcome, Andrea. If you could give a quick introduction of yourself.
Thank you, and thank you, Anna. And it's a pleasure to be here and with my fellow panelists as well. So very much looking forward to this. So as you said, I joined Citi over 20 years ago. I've been in the financial services industry for over 25 years. Started out in London, went down to Australia for what was meant to be a 2-year mandate, and it turned into 12. And I've been here in Hong Kong now for the last 10 years with Citi. I started my new role as the Chief Operating Officer for Asia in the middle of March this year. So as you can imagine, I picked it absolutely terribly in terms of timing and walked straight into a pandemic. So it's been a very interesting journey thus far. And I'm very proud to work for Citi. We're obviously a very big proponent and have long been in terms of diversity inclusion. We're thrilled to have a female who will be the first woman to run a major Wall Street bank, join to take into that seat in February of next year, and a terrific role model for us. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion this morning.
Thank you. So next we have Olga Kosters, Head of Private Debt Securities at TKO Capital. Again, her career in finance also spans across 2 decades in multilateral developed bank, private debt, as well as public capital markets. She is joining us virtually from New York today. Welcome, Olga.
Thank you, Anna. Very glad and happy to be here and joining my fellow panelists. So my career in finance services industry started about 20 years ago. And my first job out of college was at European Bank for Construction Development on a private equity team within, again, financial institutions group. So we were looking to buy banks, minority stakes in banks. And that's how my career started. And then I worked in different roles at the BRD, later on moved to Zurich Insurance in Switzerland, and then later joined Stepstone Global. And I joined TKO, my firm, now about 12 months ago. Maybe slightly better timing than Andrea, but took the full year and it was a very unique year. And essentially, I lead and had the strategy called Private Debt Secondaries.
Great. Well, welcome, Olga. And I think last but not least, our next panelist probably had more time to settle into her current role than Olga and Andrea. So the global finance industries would not have grown to the scale without international trade. So overseeing the activities and promoting the economic interests of countries are the trade commissioners. So today we're very honored to welcome Natalie Black, who is the United Kingdom Trade Commissioner for the Asia Pacific region. She's based in Singapore. So looked at her impressive resume, and she served in a number of areas within the public sector, ranging from cybersecurity, online safety, and she most recently was the deputy head of the number 10 policy unit. Welcome, Natalie.
Hi, Anna. It's so nice to see you. Thanks so much for bringing us together. It seems like a lifetime ago that I was talking to you in person in Singapore. And Olga and Andrea, really great to join you today. As Anna explained, my background is probably a little bit different from the other panelists. As the Trade Commissioner for the UK, focused on Asia Pacific. But financial services is our most valuable export from the UK's perspective. And I do think there is a role for how we conduct trade in promoting the very best of female leadership in financial services in particular, but of course also in the growing fintech sector area as well. So I hope maybe we could touch on that a little bit. My background is pretty checkered, a mix of public and private sector, but one of the areas I'm most proud to have worked on is gender pay gap reporting. And so I hope I can add a bit of a policy perspective to some of the debate today.
Great. So let us dive into the discussion. So I would like to start the phrase I mentioned in my opening introduction, that is the defined pathways for senior leadership. So in the female leadership context, this is perhaps a hybrid of diversity inclusion and a leadership training management program within an organization. So I would like to ask the panel that in their personal careers, how have they seen the design and the importance of these programs evolve over the past 15, 20 years? So I'll go in the same order as I did the intros, as I believe Andrea can kick off this topic. She has the single organization perspective, and then we'll go and have Olga, then Natalie with their views.
Thank you, Anna. So I think in terms of, in my observation, what's been really interesting, and if we think about it in the last sort of 10 or 15 years, is that a number of firms, have had a number of initiatives in terms of really trying to focus on diversity and inclusion, and to a point, I think there was a level of uncertainty in terms of what was actually working and what wasn't, and everybody knew that there needed to be a focus on it, quite rightly. But I think the real swing factor for a number of industries was when there was so much more focus from a top-down perspective. And I've been involved in a number of different initiatives over the course of, let's say, the last sort of 15 years or so, what I would classify very much as bottom-up. So it was very much a group of women coming together and trying to push policy and push the agenda and push education. And really, when I think back, and it's really the swing point was when the focus started becoming a lot more top down, from very much from the top of the house. And I could see that certainly in a city context, when I look at the makeup of, say, for example, our current chief executive, Mike Corbat's management team, which is 50% women. The board will be going to 50%, which is, a major accomplishment for a Wall Street firm and signifies major progress. But in order to get there, I would say it's been a real, if you want to call it, smorgasbord of different approaches. And that means in terms of hiring, that means in terms of training, and that means in terms of retention. So there's no one thing I would single out to say what's worked. I think it really has been it has been concerted effort in terms of having equal pipeline, particularly as it relates to female graduates coming in very much 50-50. Half of our workforce, 50% of our workforce in Asia are female. And at the same time, it's also about retaining those women. And so we've got a number of very targeted training programs around that, a number of sponsorship programs, very targeted advocacy programs, and then very clear pathways in order to help promote and advocate and move them into more senior roles. So I don't think there's any one thing I would single out in terms of having changed the agenda, but I do think having that focus very much from a top down, and being able for the rest of the business to actually see that, that change is being made has been very, very powerful from our perspective.
I'm glad you got to witness the moment when it went from grassroots, bottoms up, to the visibility of having a concerted effort from top down. That's and
excellent. I would say, just to add to that, I think probably the rate of change, and having been in the industry for a long time, probably we've made more progress in the last 5 years, I would say, than probably the prior 10 or 15. It felt to me from when I first walked onto a trading floor, I think it was in 1994, where I remember just looking around this enormous soccer pitch type floor thinking, where are all the women? And I remember thinking, but that will change. And the rate of change, quite candidly, was glacial for quite some time. But I think I'm most positive about progress now than I ever have been in my career in terms of the last, certainly 5 years and most definitely 2 years, some really positive progress.
Excellent. So, Olga, I understand that you started out in your career in the UK, but you were coming from Russia. So from a cultural perspective, was gender balance on top of mind, and how has that changed now that you're 2 decades later in New York?
It's such a great question, and I think it touches the heart of the matter, and the culture is very important, right? So I think some of it obviously comes from the environment where we grow up, and Russia was always kind of very egalitarian society and very much like a Swedish model where everyone works, and this kind of it's unheard of anyone being home. But I haven't spent that much time of my adult life in Russia, so I actually left shortly after university, and since then I lived in multiple countries. You mentioned UK. I lived for a long time in Switzerland. I'm now in the US. So I had the privilege to experience various cultures, but I also had the privilege and luck work with in several institutions and several firms. And I've seen firsthand some of the programs that were very well intended, maybe not bearing fruit, and some of the more grassroots effort from my peers and my teams, kind of helping out each other, being very, very effective. So I would say culturally, organic effort and something that's embedded, and maybe my firm TKO is a good example, where from the moment the firm was founded 16 years ago, when it was a very small startup, and now it's 27 billion in UM, women have always played a very important role, and it's something that in finance industry, the portfolio managers, female portfolio managers are not that common. So within our firm, it's very common. So we have quite a few PMs. So that's something that really a differentiating factor. And I think that's culture, that's organic. But on the other hand, one of the motivations, and we engage with our investors all the time, is to see their perspective and how they see diversity and how they seek this out. And when they meet with a very monolithic team in terms of culture, maybe they make a judgment call as to the quality of their investment decisions and how it's going to play out for them. So I think it's both what you have created within the firm, but also some of the outside forces and how you're being perceived. And I think that's what drives, especially in the asset management industry, that what drives this response that people want to see, and that brings more focus on diversity and inclusion.
So it sounds like Olga has seen quite a shift to kind of external feedback over the past 5 years, and similar to Andrea, the kind of the progress over the past 5 years seems a lot more apparent and more concrete. Great, thank you for sharing your experience. And Natalie, lastly, I think, are you seeing the development in that 15 plus 5 kind of 2 stages as well?
Yes, I think so. So, I mean, I started life as a management consultant, and actually there was a real push on gender diversity, sometimes almost to the extreme. You were felt to feel quite special. And that, can have pros and cons when you're starting out. So getting the balance there is quite right. And then over the sort of last 10 years in particular, I think the board level focus has made a massive difference. Lots of you will be familiar with the 30% Club, which started out in the UK and has chapters in all of our locations. Originally, I think it was about 9.5% of boards were 30% women for FTSE 350. That's now about 33%. So a really impressive push. And as Andrea says, it feels like there's been an escalation and progress. But when we've looked at this from a policy perspective, you're still losing a lot of people in the middle gap. It's that funnel. So you can do everything you can to push at the top to have a great cast list to interview from and select from, etc. But if you haven't got people in the funnel, that of course is really difficult. And so from a policy point of view, one of the things that we've looked at in the UK is returnships, for example. So maybe women who have decided to take a couple of years out for a whole range of reasons, providing specific opportunities and engagements to help them get back into the workforce. And maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more, but I think one of the big concerns over the next couple of years is going to be the impact of COVID on those kinds of people who maybe have had to take time out. We know COVID is going to have a regressive impact on female employment across financial services, but actually across all professional services more broadly. And so we are going to have to get smarter about some of the initiatives that will need to be championed both at the grassroots and at the board level.
Great. That's a good segue to our next topic as we kind of get into the details of what these programs look like. And I'm so glad you pointed out that, there's effort from the very top, there's effort from the beginning as everyone begins their careers. But, the common elements that we've seen in these programs, whether it could be training, whether it be executive coaching, buddy system, assigning sponsorships. And I think you just added in one, I think that's very important due to COVID, or whether it's parental leave, on how female people at the mid-career level can take a break from it for whatever reason and get back into the workforce and start their second career. How have you seen the combinations of these programs worked out and being the most effective? And it sounds like maybe we can focus the next 5 minutes on how do we address the middle gap, because all these programs and manuals are there, but they seem to be kind of telling you this is what the top looks like. But how do we effectively use these elements of training and coaching to make sure there's a good path, a smooth path in the middle? Andrea, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can do. So I think one of the things that we've put in place is some very targeted training and development, absolutely targeted to women and also of different seniorities. I personally was the beneficiary of one of the programs. I went on our City Women's Leadership Development Training Program, which was, it's global. We all flew to New York. This was back in 2009, I think it was. That was aimed at director level women. We have various different programs, Ascent and Rise, targeted at different seniorities. And that has worked incredibly well because women feel invested in, they feel engaged, they are surrounded by a cohort group that can really relate to some of what they're going through. I always describe, when I sort of talk internally, that when you look at certain sort of seniorities and you're looking at sort of women in their sort of early 30s, mid 30s, I always describe it very much as what I call the perfect storm, because it's the very time in life quite often that sometimes we're making the decisions about having a family, for example, at the very time where all those hard years of work are actually beginning to pay off and you're actually really going to starting to get some really good momentum in your career. And so you come at a little juncture. And I think what a lot of the targeted programs can do is really be able to show people that there is a pathway, that there are a number of other people that have done exactly the same thing. There are role models that people can look up to. And I always sort of say, you can't be what you can't see. And really be able to show them there are opportunities. And at the same time, I think as part of that retention is also to wrap other programs, such as, say, for example, we've got one called Maternity Matters, which is women who have elected to have a family and then want to come back into the workforce and really be able to have a buddy system at work in terms of someone that's been through that, helps them to navigate their way through, because quite honestly, none of us don't know what we don't know when we're about to embark on something new. So I do think that that's really helped what you've described, Anna, as that kind of midpoint, which is we bring them in, and Anna's exactly right. You've got the funnel, but it's how you actually make sure that your funnel is watertight and you're not actually going to lose them along the way, because you can have the most robust pipeline in the world, but if you've got a leaky funnel, then you're back to square one again. And I think that's probably what we've found to be most successful. But I think the single one I would highlight that has been really impactful, I think, has been a very targeted program around advocacy. And that is, and I think I mentioned earlier, where a bunch of women came together and tried to actually make improvements and change. That's helpful to a point, but it's actually having your male colleagues and senior men that are advocating for you, and whether they're around the boardroom table or whether they're actually around a promotions table or they're around a discussion in terms of what roles are changing and who might be good, and to be able to say, I know this person, they would be terrific in this particular role. And that is something that we've been working very heavily on in the last 3 or 4 years around advocacy, and that's had some tremendous results. So I think, to the point I made earlier, it really is about having a great mixture, but I think that's what I would say when I look at that middle point. And you also mentioned return to work programs, and we have those in India and Singapore, and we'd like to look more broadly too. I think that's where we've had probably the most success.
Great. And Olga, you mentioned earlier on that in the organizations you've been at, it's all about kind of people looking out for each other in a more informal way and kind of making sure that women look after each other. Have you seen specific programs being designed around that? What type of format and elements do you find the most effective?
I think generally when you start, the analyst hours are grueling. So people tend to bond anyway, and it continues through the career, right? So it's women and men, and we keep relationships and kind of helping each other and with advice and sometimes just cheering each other up. But I completely agree with Andrea that it's very important to have a mosaic of different programs, and then at different point and phase in career, you may find some more helpful than others. So it's very important for firms to provide a ambitious target, but secondly also this kind of a mosaic or a different sort of set of programs that may help people along the way. But the third is a very important piece. I feel like it's a personal responsibility because you're building something too, right? You have to take ownership, and this is career, and it's not easy. As Andrea was pointing out, there are periods in time when you're not going to feel good about, leaving your house at 6 a.m. or coming home really late. So there's this element of, yes, it's going to be difficult. Yes, it's maybe temporary, maybe it's a prolonged period of time, but you can do it. And then there are other people who have done it, and there's all this support work around it. So I'd say the firms who demonstrated it, and I feel like our firm does it really well too. They show the way, but they also attract talent, and they attract investors, and they attract this good kind of virtuous circle that goes with, we're doing something right, and we can do it.
Yeah, it sounds like you have all stakeholders actively participating, including your investors, and I think that's great to hear. So Natalie, from a public sector perspective, you work in a very specific functions, and I don't know that there's a concept of cohorts and buddies and mentoring system. How has that, the different elements worked for you?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very live discussion for me personally. Actually, you can't tell on Zoom, but I'm 7 months pregnant, so navigating all of this myself at the moment during COVID. And what I must say is I've personally really benefited from structured programs, actually ones that mix people from a variety of backgrounds, because it actually doesn't matter what sector you're in. Unfortunately, the problems and challenges are quite similar. Sometimes my own personal view is you have to be careful not to isolate women by creating women-only programs, which then means that the sort of main company offer or the main organization offer can sometimes reflect the view, well, we've done this for women, so we don't need to do anything else. And they can then miss out on the more integrated approach. So getting that balance between specific support and specific help, particularly at certain times. So when you're pregnant, for example, but then also making sure that women are a key part of the overall organizational strategy, and that they are seen as part of the future of any organization, almost gender neutral in many ways. And I absolutely agree with Andrea. It's about making sure that the pipeline isn't leaky, not only because that's the right thing to do, but also from a pure sort of financial point of view. You invest so heavily in your workforce, whatever organization you're in. And it's really, really expensive when people leave because they're not happy or they don't see a future for themselves. And so it really is selfishly in the interest of organizations to make it work. But also, again, as sort of Olga alluded to, I think it results in better decisions. You want a diverse workforce so that you're not leaving anyone on the sidelines, and that you're getting the best possible advice, whether that's as a government official or as a chair of the board. So overall, I think there's a really, really strong argument to invest in these kinds of programs. But my personal view is you just need to be careful to make sure that they're not too specialist sometimes, that actually they create a sort of other persona rather than part of an overall organizational strategy.
Yeah, and this is something, this is one of the next topics. Thanks for pointing that out, of, while trying to achieve for equality, not oversteering. How do we measure these results, and who is ultimately accountable? We're seeing large organizations set up targets in recent years. Is it solely on the CEO? How much of a role does a CHRO play? We're seeing chief diversity officers and equality officers being appointed. How are they partnering with the leadership to advocate for the best outcome? And I think I'll kind of have Natalie kick out this topic, because I think in the UK there's been laws and legal government initiatives introduced that basically requires company to take those initial steps. So if you could just share with us kind of how these programs have worked to date.
Yeah, sure, Anna. I mean, particularly from the point of view of the UK, but obviously countries around the world are grappling. So I don't at all suggest we're getting this completely right, but we have had a real concerted effort to make this issue more transparent. If you don't actually understand the data, it can become quite a heated debate quite quickly, but without a clear route to solving the problem, or actually, of course, understanding the scale of the problem. So in the UK, we've launched gender pay gap reporting. So this is for FTSE 250 companies are mandated to set out on an annual basis their average pay gap. So this is the average pay men and women relative to men. It's been pretty revealing, and a number of different high-profile names have been through the journey of having that data publicly available, having to answer questions both internally within their organization and externally. And I think it has genuinely resulted in better practices. One of the things we are seeing in COVID is that the actual reporting process has become more difficult, and the number of companies reporting has gone down, which is concerning. And where we do have the numbers, the pay gap has started to increase a little bit, relatively small, so sort of going from 11 to 12%, so a 1% difference, but it's not a good trend to start to see now. The thing that concerns me more actually is around what we can do to support the companies of the future. So pay gap reporting is great for understanding the now, but actually, when we look to the future, how are we setting up the economic recovery to support particularly female-led companies that we know can find it harder to attract investment? And Olga and Anna, this is your area of expertise in particular, but at least in the UK, we find that funding doesn't quite find its way to female-founded companies for a whole range of reasons. So in January to October this year, for example, only 4% of VC funding for female-founded fintechs materialized, which is very, very disappointing, and is due to a whole range of reasons, but I think highlights some of the problems we're going to have to tackle now if we want a more fair and equal future, and ultimately a more robust economy.
Yeah, SoftBank has a dedicated opportunity inertia accelerator, different initiatives set up to fund underrepresented parts of this founder community. I totally agree with you. So perhaps Andrea, with your new incoming CEO, how are we going to hold her accountable to further progress?
Well, I would say that our outgoing CEO has made enormous inroads, and it was under his stewardship that Citi was, I think, the first major US Wall Street firm to actually publish their pay equity gap, and did the analysis back in 2018, and that revealed, I think, a gap of for women of 71% versus men, and that's something that is very closely tracked and monitored. And I think was, to Natalie's point, it was really about the transparency, and that's obviously very important. We do have, I mean, the data, and I would agree completely with Natalie, is extremely important, and it's important because unless you actually have the hard data, really what happens is you are relying on a set of anecdotes, and it's very, very difficult, I think, when you're having a conversation in the room, when you've got hard data, to actually dispute those facts as opposed to disputing a series of anecdotes. And so I think that's been very important. We do get questions sometimes, which is, okay, well, you have representation goals. So we announced also at 2018, we wanted to have 40% of our workforce from assistant vice president all the way through to MD at 40% by 2021. And I'm delighted to say, I think we're within a whisker. We're literally at 39.9. We literally track it month by month. And that was as of October. And sometimes people sort of say, well, is that a target? And I said, you know, the whole point of this is that it's not about having quotas. And I'm personally quite anti-quotas that you've seen in certain geographies around the world, because for me, ultimately, it really is about the meritocracy. But what it does do, and is having the data, is to say all of the things that the four of us have just described, which is around having your pipeline and you're, you know, making sure you're retaining people and you've got your training programs and advocacy and sponsorship. And various back to work programs. It's making sure that all of those things along the way are actually working, because if they're working, you'll see it in the data coming through. So it's not about managing to the data. It really is about using the data to actually show the progress that it's being made. And really being able to therefore show that, you know, in terms from an accountability perspective, and I don't think it's just the job of one person or a CEO, I think it's all of our accountability. I think it's important for all of us to understand that this is a shared goal. And exactly to Natalie's point, which is a lot of times not only is it the right thing to do for us and the people that follow us, but also because it's the right thing for the firm. Quite, you know, obviously from a talent diversity and from an economic perspective, particularly around the retention piece. So it all makes sense. So I would say it's very much a shared accountability.
Right. So shared accountability, we have data in hand, we know the progress we've made. But of course, we've been hit with the pandemic this year that kind of sets us back some of the things that Natalie mentioned about increasing pay gap again, or people being, female founders being underfunded. How do we reshape our defined path in this virtual world? Realistically speaking, we won't be able to network as freely as in person as we would. How do we practice leadership in this virtual format? Any tips and advice that you can give us over the past 9 months or so?
Sorry, Anna, is that one for me?
Whoever wants to go first. Who's done the most Zoom meetings out of all of us? Perhaps, Olga, with your US and European colleagues, you're very used to working virtually, remotely. Has this been a big transition, big, you know, change in format you have to get used to?
Absolutely. But first, let me send congratulations to Natalie. Great news.
Oh, thank you, Olga. That's very kind.
All the best wishes. Yes, Zoom had been very popular and very unpopular at the same time. So everyone loves to hate it, but and hates to love it. So we were kind of using it, and it's becoming a very important tool for us. So I remember, and for us, the lockdown in New York especially was very quick and sudden. So I remember the 1 week we were still sort of thinking about how we come to work, and considering this deteriorating environment around us, be safe, and how we protect our teams. And then on Monday, we were sort of, well, this is it. We're on a lockdown. Everyone must leave. So it was very sudden. I have to give credit to the team first and foremost, because we very quickly managed to kind of self-organize, and then we had brief calls, and then across the firm, we had brief calls on daily basis, but across the firm, we also had some of the activities that we would normally not have. For example, we had this kind of the quizzes, the competitions, just to boost the morale, and it was something that people enjoyed a lot. It was very silly and very funny, but everyone loved it. So that was great. We had some kind of workshops around yoga. So there was a lot of interesting ideas, and they were coming from young people. They were coming from everyone. So it took all of us to kind of keep this.
Yeah, I guess in this virtual world, this gender neutral, age neutral, we're just all of the same shape and sizes.
One thing, and I was thinking about, obviously COVID had a tremendous impact, a lot of negative aspects associated with it. If I were to search for silver lining, one thing I would say is that parents and families got closer somehow together, right? And it was kind of the shared experience before. If one person was working and another was sitting at home, they almost like lived separate lives. And during this period of time, everything got kind of mixed and upside down. So people got to share experiences of, their close relatives, but not something that they might have had before. So that may be a silver lining for what we're gone through.
Yeah, with that silver lining, I hope that, and once the vaccine is commonly available, we can mix the best of both worlds, reach people in other parts of the world virtually, and be closer with those nearby. Unfortunately, we're just coming up to our 40 minutes. I've been prompted, but thank you all again to all fellow panelists. And I hope for those of you watching, you'll find your defined path in your careers. So on behalf of all panelists, thank you all again for spending the past 40 minutes with us. Please enjoy the next 3 days at the Milken Asia Summit. Stay safe and healthy, and look forward to seeing everyone in person next year.
And huge thanks, obviously, to our partners at the Milken Institute. It was great to see some of those contributions. That was Anna Lowe, Investment Director at SoftBank, speaking to Natalie Black, Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for the Asia Pacific. She's from the UK. Andrea Fletcher, Citi's Chief Operating Officer for Asia. Olga Kostas, Head of Private Debt Secondaries at Tikehau Capital, on that panel discussing women leaders and how they're shaping finance and how they're supporting the next generation of female leaders. It was a really interesting conversation.